Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. First of all, I'd like to thank the organisers and especially the Atlantic Treaty Association for facilitating my presence here today. This is a fascinating forum and extremely timely, and I'm honoured to be part of it. I've kept my intervention in a modular format because being at the end of a huge panel, you end up with everybody taking your points. So I have 4 sections, but they're smaller sections than they were at the beginning of the panel. I intend to just touch on the threat, response, thank you, partnerships, and NATO itself. I'll try and keep it short. I realise that the timings are no longer where they once were. I think the questions are likely to be the area where you'll get most out of my presence, at least, because I know that NATO, at least from the outside, seems very monolithic, and it's hard to understand how it goes about things. So I hope I can be the approachable face, at least on counter-terrorism, and try and help be transparent to what's going on. I'd just like, before I start, to say that the Secretary General, our new Secretary General, who came into office on the 1st of October, said that NATO is 28 nations, representing 1 billion people, and that the security situation at the moment was the most challenging that it had been for 20 years. He was, of course, speaking about the threat not only from the southern border of NATO, but also the east. But given the complexity of the current security situation, there are niches for all, and we are today in search of common solutions to common challenges. And I was very struck by Ambassador Masade's comment that security was not the only optic. The threat that we face at present is always called the terrorist threat at the moment, but ISIS, I would argue, the Islamic State, again, I don't agree with the nomenclature, but I could try calling it Daesh, but I'm not sure whether my attempts at Arabic are worth it. I would say that ISIS was more an insurgency using terrorist tactics. It is an organization that claims statehood. It's holding territory. This is not common behavior for a terrorist group. It seeks status as a government, and it has indeed a veneer of government, but it's holding together a very mixed bag of peoples because of its rapid advance. Any solution to the current situation in Iraq and Syria is going to be based on the population itself. But that solution is population-centric, not only in that region, but also far, far further afield. The last speaker mentioned how rich the Islamic State is, well, Daesh is. It's true, they're a very rich terrorist organization, but they're a very poor country. And to be able to govern, you need a stable source of funding. And I don't think that at the moment that can be said of Daesh. They are depraved and barbaric, and they are sparing no one. Their victims are from all sectors of the population. They ignore religious voices, and they disgust the majority. But there are vulnerabilities. That disgust from the majority is certainly a point of leverage. But on the other hand, youth, our youth from all our countries, are flocking to that message to be part of the violence that goes with it. And they're living in a social media bubble. I was interested on the comment that there were no mainstream media that represented the situation. And certainly it's true for the youth who join Daesh from our countries. It's entirely self-contained, this self-reinforcing media bubble. We are told by the EU counter-terrorism coordinator at the moment that there are 3,000 European foreign fighters in theatre. And that's thought to be about a quarter of the total figure. So the issue is affecting a far wider catchment area than just the Mediterranean area. Some 80 nations now are thought to have foreign fighters in Iraq and Syria. And the issue is spread not only because of the contribution to the fighting, but also the movement of the people. There are now some 8 million internally displaced people from Iraq and Syria, and on top of that, the vast refugee issue. And the issue doesn't go away just because you've moved. And those communities too, whilst extremely needy, also change the composition of the cultures in the countries they move to. Now, a little on the response. We're currently thinking about airstrikes and no boots on the ground and helping the situation and leaving. And that seems to be more or less a consensual approach. There's a common desire, and many of the speakers have mentioned it, for a broad-based strategy. And the United States Central Command, US CENTCOM, appears to be working to that idea with the coalition of some 60 nations who are now together for this approach. And the priorities of CENTCOM include providing support to military partners, stopping the foreign fighter flow, in fact, dealing with the foreign fighter issue both before they travel from their home nations, when they are in the field, because some of these individuals, when they move to the theatre of fighting, are more extreme than the local inhabitants because they don't have the context of the culture that they're working in. So before they travel, when they're in theatre, and when they go back to the countries they came from, it's a big challenge across the board. There is also attention placed on the financing of ISIL, as several of the other speakers have mentioned. But it's a hard thing to stop an oil market. You can say, no, of course, we will prevent funds reaching the Islamic State. But if you want to buy oil and you're the next door neighbor, you're going to buy it. It's maybe illegal at the level of United Nations, but when it comes to a domestic market, it's a hard thing to stop. And the last thing that CENTCOM, I know, is focused on is preventing the legitimization of ISIL's ideology. The treatment of minorities, majorities even, is so totally unacceptable that this is a key issue for leverage. But in the end, whatever CENTCOM does, whatever a coalition does, it will come down to Iraqis retaking Iraq. They need help from their neighbors, and they need external assistance to weaken the opposition. And airstrikes buy time, but they don't solve the situation. Preparing Iraqi forces to act in the longer term is the key issue. I'd like to underline that counter-terrorism is not just a battlefield response. In fact, most of the time it is not a battlefield response at all. It is a domestic issue for all those nations involved, those who form the theatre, but those who contribute in terms of having fighters from their nations in that country. They too have an immense task at home. It's a very big job because it involves all sections of a domestic government, and over and above the government, it involves civil society. Internal coordination, so one nation sorting out its own counter-terrorism strategy, is a real challenge. It's very hard to get ministries to talk to each other and be coherent and have the same final goal, but it's even more difficult when you're trying to bring in the non-governmental organizations, the charities, the education groups, the ethnic groups, the cultural groups, all of whom have a role to play in this. It's a holistic approach. There are big movements afoot on the international stage to try and provide a framework for nations to take action in this. I'd remind you of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2178, which was adopted 2 weeks ago during the UN General Assembly Week. And it's on foreign fighters. But it's a really difficult document. I encourage you to look at it because whilst it addresses the situation, it also goes painfully close to what is acceptable to us. It starts to challenge people's freedom to move. It starts to challenge their ability to cross borders. Now, the security aspect is essential, but so are human liberties. So it's a very difficult area to be playing in, this one. Partnerships. As many of the other speakers have said, they're essential. There is little hope for success without them. But there are different types of partnerships, and I would argue that there is a sort of layering effect of partnerships. It goes from the level of the UN all the way down to an intercultural, just a small society group. You can think about partnerships as being either a group of like-minded people together to be a stronger voice, or it could be including those who are perhaps less like-minded because, as they say, it's always safer to have people on the inside shooting out. The size, the power, the legitimacy, the credibility of the different formats of partnerships vary enormously. And there are already a lot of differing partnerships involved in the issue of terrorism in the region and worldwide. There are the international organizations. There's the coalition of 60, as I mentioned. There are the non-governmental organizations. Particularly working on the foreign fighter issue is the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum, which is 29 nations plus the EU. And they have a working group, which is led by the Dutch, and they have done a lot of work in bringing together best practice on what to do about those traveling from our countries to fight in the Iraq and Syria forum. And they were their paper, which was presented in New York, was the foundation on which the Security Council resolution was built. All of these different organizations take the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy as their framework. So there's hope that this can be used as a nucleus. We are all going in the same direction by slightly differing routes with different strengths. We have to use the specific strengths of each of the different partnership formats to the best end, making networks of the various different formats. Because so many different types of support are needed. We need to provide support to the tribal areas, to the tribes themselves, because effectively they've been bitten once, and they'll need concessions if they're to successfully fight off Daesh a second time. On the religious front, there is no way on earth that the European nations, the US, Canada, can be the ones trying to intervene in a sectarian issue. This is something that only the neighbors can do, only those of the same understandings, of the same upbringings, effectively. And the army needs support. It needs hand-holding from countries in the region, and it needs support from further afield. But they also need support for society, for education. Several of the speakers have mentioned how important it is to address the future for the youth bulge in the Mediterranean area as a whole, the Gulf as well. There has to be some way to contribute to a future that the youth can envision themselves living in. I understand that really in Iraq, the moderates are effectively a floating vote, and we cannot afford for them to be won over by ISIL, by the Islamic State. In terms of offering a future to a population, I'm not sure where the NATO role in this comes, because as you know, of course, NATO is a military, civilian military, political military alliance, and it's a tool. It's not a societal influence, it's a tool. It was created for collective defense, so it was created to look after its 28, now 28 allies, but it also does cooperative security and crisis management. Cooperative security is NATO's way of saying outreach to partners. So this is the partnership aspect for NATO. And NATO thinks of partnership as the way to push back the threat by ensuring common understanding of the threat and a common approach, and ideally, common action. NATO is where North America and Europe meet, so its view on life is different to the solely European formats, different organizations. There's a slightly nuanced view bringing together two continents. Our new Secretary General has stated that his priorities are to keep NATO strong, to keep the neighborhood stable by working with partners, and to keep the transatlantic bond strong. The core mission for NATO is collective defense. And recently, in the context of Turkey particularly, there have been a lot of statements saying how whatever it takes will be done by the Allies to protect the Allies. So although it's the core mission, has NATO got a role? Although collective defense is the core mission of NATO, is there a real strong role for NATO in counter-terrorism? Well, I have the job, so I would argue yes. As it said in the communique from the Wales summit the other day, NATO works with partners in combating terrorism. And there it's talking about operations. It's talking about Operation Active Endeavour, it's talking about ISAF. Our only counter-terrorism operation at the moment is Operation Active Endeavour, which is patrolling in the Mediterranean. But if Iraq were to ask, and if the Allies consider there is a role for NATO, we could be part of support to Iraq in terms of helping develop the Iraqi Defense Forces, coordinating Allied airlift of humanitarian assistance. But I think the biggest role for NATO in that theatre is the long-term defence capacity building. It's helping Iraq be strong enough to govern such challenges that rise up from inside. On Syria, there isn't any consensus at the moment. The US is defending Syria against the Islamic State, but most of the coalition is not yet prepared to join the Americans in that action. I think there are 5 partners who are at the moment. During the second intervention, you heard a little about how NATO works with its partners, about how the individual cooperation programs between NATO and its partners set the framework for work together. And the Mediterranean dialogue, which is the North African coast, is now much closer to NATO than it was before. Our last speaker spoke of the need for assistance and for choosing your partners carefully. Well, I think NATO has already chosen its partners carefully for those 2 programs. And on the Mediterranean dialogue side, each of the partners now has a cooperation program with NATO, and together we work on the 2 key aspects of counterterrorism that NATO expresses in its policy for counterterrorism. And the first one is awareness of the threat. We have a dialogue to ensure that there is a common understanding of the threat. And then work on capabilities. This is NATO nations' expertise and capabilities being brought to bear on partner nations. So, and sometimes it works the other way around. The ambassador was saying that we should be asking. Well, we are asking. It's a question of bringing in expertise to NATO, as well as the NATO allies being able to share with their partners. So the 2 key areas for NATO for working with partners are awareness and capabilities. Dr.
Bird, your conclusion?
Yes, of course, I will conclude now. In fact, I was just about to. There have been calls for creativity. I think Professor Luciolo at the beginning said that more creativity should be brought to bear on this, but I have to underline the current reality in that the economic situation and political conservatism do make it an uphill struggle to take on new challenges. So perhaps I'll leave you with the question. The terrorism issues we're looking at are not just Iraq and Syria. They're far further flung than that. So should NATO be trying to help further afield? What about Mali? What about Yemen? What about Horn of Africa, Nigeria, Boko Haram? Are these areas in which NATO should be looking for partnership and looking to be able to help? I warn you again that resources and sufficient expertise will be an issue. And I leave you with the thought that one must always choose the best tool for the job. And in the Iraq-Syria theatre, is NATO the right tool for the job? I would argue that CENTCOM is doing a good job at the moment. We will see in the longer term whether NATO is turned to for any assistance. As a very last thought, counter-terrorism for me is not just the military activity. It is the domestic approach that strengthens each country to cope with the threat coming from within or coming back to it from abroad. Thank you.